Good morning. Good morning. I'm Denise Benning. I am the Acting Deputy Director of the Office of eHealth Standards and Services at CMS, and it's my pleasure to serve as this year's executive sponsor of the CMS Annual Holocaust Memorial Program. This program, as well as similar ones at other federal agencies, is presented in response to Public Law 96-388, which calls for a, quote, annual national civic commemoration of the Holocaust. At CMS, we annually observe a Holocaust Remembrance Day, or Yom HaShoah, by memorializing those who perished and honor those who survived. We gather here today to recall the memory of the 6 million women, men, and children who perished at the hands of the Nazis, 6 million people whose sole crime was to be Jewish. The aim was to annihilate an entire people, their faith, their culture, and their world. We remember not only the Jews, but also the 5 million political opponents, homosexuals, gypsies, the disabled, all those who did not fit the Nazi description of who should live. Not only Jews, but Poles, Czechs, Romanians, Ukrainians, and so many others were victims of the Nazi evil. The indignity of Jews having to register was echoed again this past April, when flyers telling Ukrainian Jews in Kiev that they had to register with the government, a sick hoax or not, found their way into the streets of Kiev, sending a ghostly chill across the nations of the world and an outpouring of concern and disgust at its implied message. I grew up in New York City, and although I'm not Jewish, I was surrounded by Jewish culture and Jewish tradition. My father worked for a company owned by a Jewish family, and we became their family in many ways. We were always invited to their children's bar or bat mitzvahs, as well as their weddings and other special occasions. My mother grew up in Brooklyn, and she had an affinity for languages, so she knew just enough Yiddish to make sure that I was able to wish our Jewish friends Aziz and Pesach at Passover. My grandmother would travel to the fish markets in Manhattan to buy whitefish, or what they called chubs, for her homemade gefilte fish. And when I attended college and my Jewish roommate was unable to go home for Passover Seder, we held one in our dorm room, complete with self-made matzo ball soup. We were so ignorant about cooking in general and Jewish cooking in particular that we had to call up her grandmother late one night to find out how to get chicken fat off a chicken. We never were able to live that one down. And I remember the first time I saw the inside wrist of a roommate's mother tattooed with her ID numbers from her time in a concentration camp. That image and her testimony, more than anything else I've ever experienced, has made me understand that being a Jew is so much more than just ethnic food and traditions. I moved to Kansas City, where my husband and I raised our family in suburban Overland Park, Kansas. I worked at Menorah Medical Center, a facility founded in the 1920s because Jewish doctors couldn't get admitting privileges on the medical staffs of the area hospitals at the time. It was, and still is today, a large and robust Jewish community. And it was at that time that we saw the movement of many young Jewish families from the inner city areas to the suburban sprawl that became the Kansas City metro area. Menorah moved its campus from Midtown Kansas City to Overland Park. I frequently spoke to community groups at the Jewish Community Center there, and I was horrified at the hatred of one deranged man who took it upon himself a few weeks ago to resurrect the hatred of the Nazi movement at that same facility. I remember when that facility was built and how the community, both Jewish and Gentile alike, embraced it. Ironically, the 3 people he killed were not Jews, but this was clearly his intent. This is not the Kansas City I knew and still know today, and I am saddened that its reputation has been smeared by the ugly specter of anti-Semitism. That's not what they're about. The enormity of the evil which drove the Holocaust is impossible to comprehend. At most, we can read and hear the personal stories of individuals and families who were there and survived. Many of the stories we'll never know. Those who died tell their tales only through the small bits of memories that are left behind. Therefore, it is important for us to hear the first-hand testimony of those who survived and witnessed the horrors of the Holocaust. With each passing year, the number of living survivors and liberators grows smaller. And with all of the existing evidence, there are still people today who deny that the Holocaust ever happened. We are very fortunate and honored to have a survivor with us today. Holocaust survivors, like our keynote speaker, are messengers. Their stories bring to our lives the reality of a horrific time in a real and direct and forceful way. We learn from them the truth of the inhumanities of the world and rededicate ourselves to increase the humanity in our own lives. Therefore, memorial programs such as this are so important. We need to listen and to learn from the survivors and the witnesses about the horrors that they saw. We must never, ever allow another Holocaust to happen again. And at this time, it is my pleasure to introduce Rabbi Tsvi Schur for our invocation. Rabbi?
I'll first light the candle, which represents the souls of those that passed away. It's called the Yisker candle, memorial candle. I hope to light it. Try this side. We have come together again this year, a little late, to commemorate the greatest crime in human history, that of the Holocaust. Whereas a rabbi, I usually am expected to offer prayers to our Creator, to the Almighty. I will do so now as well, but first prior with a specific explanation. Almighty, you have been asked where you were during the Holocaust. You were asked by survivors. You were asked by those who study history. As mature members of the Western community, it is our responsibility to ask not where was God during the Holocaust, but where were the people? Where was humanity? And where was Western civilization during those terrible years? In the 1930s and 1940s, the years in which the Holocaust took place, people were supposedly cultured, sophisticated, humane, and conscious of their deeds. Germany, at that time, stood at the cutting edge of Western culture and intellectual accomplishments. German science and technology, concern for animal rights, moral philosophy, and artistic creativity set the standards among Western nations. And yet, in a matter of a decade, this paragon of modernity and culture had deliberately murdered over 6 million innocent civilians and waged a war that killed more than 40 million souls. To just ask where was God during the era of the Holocaust is, in a sense, to renounce human accountability in the world, which is far more troubling than the question, where was God during the Holocaust? Today, we thought that we had learned the lessons of the past, knowing that there cannot be a bright future if we do not remember the past. But sadly, can we blame God today for what is going on in Syria, where over 150,000 people have already been killed in this cruel civil war? Can we only blame God for what is going on in Iraq, Iran, in the Ukraine? The world continues to really stand by hopelessly, as countless atrocities, as long as they're not committed within our immediate vicinity, are being done. Almighty, perhaps if more of us turned to you, perhaps if more of us realized that you are our Creator and the conscious of all, perhaps if more of us realized how awesome you are, and that to you we owe our gift of life, and at the end of time we will have to answer for all our failures and misuse of this gift. Almighty, though we may not be deserving, please intervene and give us the strength to correct the wrong and do what is right. Let this generation know that unwarranted hatred only causes bloodshed, not just in faraway countries, but when young teens are knifed and gunned down in our own neighborhoods. We live in a time when there seems to be no appreciation for human life. Almighty, as we begin this program today, remember all those who are murdered by those who preach hatred, by those who in truth are hardly worthy to be called your children. But let us who understand, those of us who feel the pain of those who suffered, be truly worthy of your title of being God's children. May the day come soon when hatred, terrorism, and war will finally cease, and your kingdom alone will reign. Amen.
Good morning. My name is David Walzak, and I'm a co-chair of the CMS Holocaust Memorial Program Committee. On behalf of the committee, I have the honor of introducing our guest speaker, Mr. Charles Heller. Mr. Heller was born in Czechoslovakia and grew up in a small town outside of Prague. His father was Jewish, his mother was Catholic. Charles was raised Catholic. However, according to the Nuremberg laws, he was considered Jewish. In order to save Charles from being deported to a death camp, Charles's mother hid him on a farm. Today, we will hear Mr. Heller's story of survival as a hidden child. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Charles Heller.
Thank you very much. And thank you for the opportunity to tell you the story of a different kind of Holocaust survivor. There was a time when I felt embarrassed to call myself a Holocaust survivor. After all, I have no number tattooed on my arm. I was never in a concentration camp. Instead, I was one of Europe's so-called hidden children, hidden from the Nazis by some kind, courageous people, and protected by the bravest person that I've ever known, my mother. But since the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum informed me that it considers me a survivor, I've embraced the role and I've attempted to live up to the obligations that come with it. Before he was murdered in the Holocaust, a gentleman named David Berger wrote a note which survived him. If something happens, I would want there to be somebody who would remember that someone named D. Berger had once lived. This will make things easier for me in difficult moments. I'm extremely grateful for the fact that you're here because you consider it important to remember. Elie Wiesel warns us that to forget is to kill twice. As an expression of gratitude for the happy ending to my own story and in honor of David Berger, my own 25 murdered family members, and 6 million others, I'd like to tell you the story that I call Prague, My Long Journey Home. I was born, as David said, I was born in 1936, which was 3 years before the Nazis invaded Czechoslovakia, my native country. Just to get a geographical reference, this is a artist's version of a map of Europe, and the red portion that you see highlighted in the middle is actually today's Czech Republic, and just to the right of that, to the east, is Slovakia, and those two originally made up the country of Czechoslovakia. To be a little bit more specific and show you as a reference to what I'm going to be talking about and where I come from, you'll see in that rectangle the city of Prague, which is the capital, of course, was the capital of the Czechoslovakia and is now the capital of the Czech Republic, this is where I was born. But I was actually brought up in a village called Kojetice, which was about 11 kilometers northeast of Prague, approximately at the upper right-hand corner of that rectangle that you see. Before the war started, I grew up in a very wealthy family. This is a picture of my great-grandfather, whose name was Gustav Neumann. He was my maternal great-grandfather, who came to this little town and opened a general store back in the early 1900s. And eventually he became the first importer of Singer sewing machines to Czechoslovakia. And with those Singer sewing machines, he built a company that became the largest manufacturer of women's dresses and men's work clothes in Central Europe. So when I was born into a family which was quite well-to-do, wealthy, and very philanthropic. And I say here in the second bullet, Heller-Neumann families. My father, Rudolf Heller, actually came to work for my great-grandfather, and he married the boss's granddaughter, my mother, Ilona. Now this tells you a little about our strange household. Our household was strange in a couple of ways, from a standpoint of religion, as well as the gender of people. You see here that in our household, the people who lived with us were my great-grandfather, who was a Jew, my grandfather, his two sons, my grandfather and his brother, my great-uncle, who were also Jews, my father, who was a Jew, my mother, who was born to a Jewish father and a Catholic mother, was raised as a Catholic, so she was a Catholic, and when I was born, I was raised as a Catholic as well, and I was baptized in that church that you see in the picture, which was directly across the street from where we lived. My grandfather and my grandmother never married, and this is, you see there, the second bullet. My maternal grandmother lived in another town which was quite far away. So we had this strange household which was male-dominated, my mother being the only female in the household, other than the servants and my nannies and so forth. All the Jews in our family, totally secular. In fact, when I was a boy, I didn't even know what a Jew was, and so our family was totally secular. And just like all the other families in our town, we celebrated Christmas, we celebrated Easter, and so forth. This is just a little wiring diagram of our family. If you start at the right end, you see those are my grandparents, and my paternal grandfather, Leopold Heller, was actually drafted into the Austro-Hungarian army in World War I, and he died during the war and was buried in Budapest, and I never met him. But you can see here again the kind of the flow of the religion. I'm the one on the left. That was my name originally, which was eventually changed when I was naturalized as a U.S. citizen. The Nuremberg laws, which some of you may be familiar with, were passed in Germany in the mid-1930s. And it's important from my personal standpoint that one of the several definitions of a Jew under the Nuremberg laws was a person having 3 or 4 Jewish grandparents. So therefore, by that definition, I had 3 Jewish grandparents, so by that definition, I was Jewish. And again, I want to emphasize the fact that our family was totally, other than the 2 devout Catholics, my mother and me, the family was totally secular, and this little kid, myself, didn't even know what a Jew was. But at that time, Czechoslovakia was still an independent state, so the Nuremberg laws really didn't apply to us at that point. But in 1938, things began in Europe. First, for Czechoslovakia, there was what I call the treachery in Munich, where England and France signed an agreement with Hitler to give away part of Czechoslovakia, the part called the Sudetenland, which was occupied by primarily German ethnic people who wanted to become part of Germany. Does that sound familiar to you? It's what's happening today in the Ukraine. And England and France said that they were buying peace in our time. A man named Neville Chamberlain said those very famous words, not knowing that what Hitler really wanted much more than the Sudetenland. He wanted all of Czechoslovakia and all of Europe. Then, of course, Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass. happened. Most people think this only took place in Germany. It took place in Czechoslovakia as well as in Austria, and all of the things that happened, including 30,000 Jewish men being sent to concentration camps. Then it finally it happened in Czechoslovakia on March 15, 1939. The Germans invaded. This is a picture of Hitler standing in the Prague castle, looking out the window at Prague. Hitler had said earlier on to his underlings that the day I own Prague is the day I own Europe. So this must have been a very happy day for Hitler. My father, my Jewish father, escaped, and his goal was to join the British Army and to fight against the Nazis. And my relatives began to disappear one by one. And at this point, I'm 3 years old, and of course, I don't understand any of this that's going on at the time. Now the Nuremberg laws do apply in Czechoslovakia, so I am defined as a Jew, and again, not understanding any of that. And finally, the only people who are left behind are my mother, my great-grandfather, whom I call Dědeček, which is a familiar name for grandfather, actually, in Czech. And so Dědeček, my mother, and I were the only ones left. And finally, the Germans came, and they took over our factory and took our home. And they threw us out with only those things that we could carry in 3 suitcases. This is what happened to the country, just very, very quickly. Czechoslovakia actually ceased to exist at that point. It became a protectorate of Germany, and the Slovak part was broken away as a separate fascist state. For us, we were taken in, the 3 of us were taken in by friends who were farmers in the same town where we lived, in Kojetic. Here you can see a picture of my mother and me, and you can tell by our clothing we are no longer one of the richest families in the country. And on the right are the 2 farmers. That's Mr. Tuma and his wife, who were my saviors, who kept me alive throughout World War II. And that's me sitting behind the horses. Mr. Tuma is teaching me how to ride on a plow behind the horses. I was confined to the farm. I was not allowed to go outside the farm. And my mother worked in the fields every day, 6 days a week, and the Tumas were gone as well. So my great-grandfather and I became best friends. We made a very odd couple, the 81-year-old man and at this point now, a 5-year-old boy. But then came a very devastating moment. I came down for breakfast one morning, and I saw my great-grandfather standing there in this same suit that you see, except the suit had a yellow star on it. And he had a beat-up suitcase standing by his feet. And I asked him where he was going, and he told me he was just going away on vacation for a while. Of course, he wasn't going on vacation. He was being taken away by transport, first to Prague, and then to the concentration camp of Terezín, which is in the Czech Republic, which was strictly a gateway to the death camps. After the war, we discovered that my great-grandfather, my best friend, was murdered at Treblinka in October of that same year. So now I was really alone. My only friends were the animals on the farm. Excuse me. And I was not allowed to go to school because of the Jewish part of my family, but again, I was not aware of this. And whenever I would ask, why can't I go to school like my former friends are going? Why are we not getting enough food? And all of these things. Why do I have to stay confined behind the walls? The answer I always got from my mother and from the farmers who were staying is because your father is fighting against the Germans. And because of that, I took all of these things that were happening to me as a point of pride. And in fact, the 1 or 2 times that I was allowed outside the wall, my mother told me I don't recall, but my father had given me, before he left when he was in the Czechoslovak army, he had given me a metal airplane. And I ran around the town holding that airplane saying, I'm my father flying in the American Air Force and I'm killing Germans. And my mother didn't think that was a very good idea, so I got locked up behind the walls of the farm again. The one time I did come out, I wanted to see some of my friends in the afternoon when the kids were getting out of school. I came out, and my mother, for the only time ever, made me wear the Star of David on my shirt. And I went outside and I waited for the kids near the school. And when they came out, they all walked down the other side of the street. And I expected them to come over and greet me because we had been friends, and I had entertained them in our house, and they had eaten dinner at our house, and so forth. They all started throwing rocks at me, and they stoned me. A lot of the rocks hit me, and I was at this point totally confused about what was going on and why people who had been our friends were no longer our friends. My mother was sent to a racial court. My mother was trying to prove a lie, actually, with the help of her mother, my grandmother, my Christian grandmother, by going to court and claiming that my grandfather, my mother's father, was Christian, which of course was not true. But my grandmother swore to that twice in a court in Prague. And my mother was taken to racial court where they were trying to prove that she, in fact, was Jewish, and they did all the terrible things that the Nazis did, claiming, that there were certain physical characteristics of Jews. They measured the size of her nose and all of these terribly insulting things. We never found out, or my mother never found out, how these trials came out, because they just never came to a conclusion, except for the fact that 3 times we packed to go on a transport to a camp. My mother each time told me that we were going on vacation, and I always wondered, why didn't we actually go? And it turned out that my mother just, we packed, and then my mother just refused to show up. For some strange, incredible reason, they never came after us, so 3 times we were saved from going to a concentration camp. Then the Germans eventually took the farm away from all the local farmers, and all of the farming was concentrated on one very large farm. And the place that everybody, all the farm workers, all the farmers who had their own farms now came to work for this very large state farm. And the workers were all living in what the local people call the castle, which you see here. There's a poor picture taken from a postcard. Zamek, the word up in the upper right-hand corner, means castle in Czech, and that's where we went to live. And but the worst thing that happened to me at that point was that Mother was ordered to go to a slave labor camp. And she was supposed to take me with her, and she hid me with the Tumas in this place called the Castle. It was a slave labor camp for Christian wives of Jewish men, where they made windshields for German airplanes. And I knew at this point, I still didn't really understand, but I started to figure things out, that things were really bad when I saw my mother crying at the railroad station and asking the Tumas to please take care of her son. So it was a really very sad time for me and I spent most of the time living in a closet. It wasn't anything like Anne Frank or some of the others who had to be hidden forever. Whereas I only went into that closet when the Gestapo or the Czech Nazi collaborators came around looking for me. Mrs. Tuma would hide me in the closet in this place called the Castle. In the meantime, we had no idea whether my father was still alive or not. We never heard anything from him, and of course he had no idea whether or not we were alive. He had escaped, and he was arrested in Yugoslavia trying to hook up with the partisans there. He escaped from just before his trial, and he eventually joined up with the British Army in what is now Israel, what was then Palestine, and where they were forming the Czechoslovak division of the British Army. My father ended up coming home a war hero. He was in North Africa, where he fought under Montgomery against Rommel. He was at Dunkirk. He was in the invasion on D-Day, And then he was assigned to General Patton's U.S. Third Army, which was supposed to come to Czechoslovakia to liberate us. Unfortunately, that didn't quite happen that way. The liberation did take place in 1945. The Prague Uprising, actually this is the anniversary of the Prague Uprising, just took place on the 5th of May. It started, where Czech citizens started fighting against the Germans because the Germans were running all over Europe and trying to get back to Germany. All the soldiers didn't want to be captured by the Soviets, who knew were quite brutal. They wanted to be captured by civilized Americans and Brits, and so the Czechs were fighting against them with whatever weapons they could find. And they expected the Americans, because they knew that the Americans were coming in from Germany, from the west side into a town called Plzeň, in English, Pilsen. Some of you may be familiar with Pilsner beer, which comes from there. They got as far as Plzeň, and Eisenhower, who then ordered Patton to stop. And it turned out that Eisenhower had made a pact with a Soviet field marshal that we would be liberated by the Red Army and not the Americans. And they had to sit there for 3 days while Czechs were dying in Prague. And ultimately, on May 9th, we were liberated, and I would put that word in quotes. We were liberated by the Soviet Red Army. Just before that happened in that last week, I came out of my hiding and out of my closet, and I was told that the Germans were escaping, were running, and it was very hard for all of us to believe that after 5.5 years, our oppressors were really leaving. But a couple of kids that I met outside told me that they were coming down the highway, which was about 2 kilometers from where we were living, and that they were escaping toward Germany. So we wanted to see the exodus, so the 3 of us went out to the highway. And by the time we got there, the Germans were gone. However, they wanted to be captured unarmed. So because of that, they were throwing their weapons away along the way. And I found a revolver, a Walther revolver, which was loaded, and I stuck it behind my belt, up underneath my belt. And I told the other kids, I'm going to shoot a German. And of course, they laughed at me for my bravado. Well, it turned out that there were some Germans and some Czech collaborators who were in the town and who were packing to leave. And we sneaked through the bushes, and I saw this guy who was loading furniture onto a truck. He was dressed in green pants, a light green undershirt with suspenders and boots. So obviously, to me, I thought that he was a soldier, and And one of these other kids said to me, well, are you going to do it? Well, I had to at that point, since I had bragged, so I stood up and I put the gun into my 2 hands, just like I had seen in American movies before the war. And I pulled the trigger, and bam! And the guy went down on the ground, and I ran off, and the other kids ran off in another direction. And I didn't know whether I had killed him or not, but I hoped that I had. And at that point, it was one of the most exhilarating moments of my life, until then and even now, where I felt that I had single-handedly won the war. I didn't talk about this. It was later on, it became rather traumatic for me because I was worried that I had committed murder. So I didn't even tell my parents until much. I told my mother in 2004. And I wondered what my mother would say, and my mother said, "You did good." My father never did hear the story. He died in 1988. We had a great reunion, the 3 of us. Unfortunately, we were the only ones who came back. At the time I started researching for my memoir, I wrote in the book that we lost 15 members of our family, unfortunately, and just in the last couple of years, then I've been going back and forth. Each time I go to the Czech Republic, I find out there were more. The number is more like 25. My grandfather and great-grandfather were murdered trying to escape. my Dedechek, my great-grandfather, was murdered in Treblinka. My grandmother was murdered in a small camp called Izbica in Poland. So 25 members of our family. And I think most of you are familiar with some of these numbers. The one number that might shock you, and which really has only come out very recently, researchers at the Holocaust Museum, there were 42,500 camps of various kind. This isn't just death camps or concentration camps. This includes the slave labor camps and the POW camps and what the Nazis called the care centers. And the reason this is so important, the Holocaust Museum has really made a big deal of this, is because there are still so many Germans who are quite old now, who lived during the war, who claim that they knew nothing about any of this. Can you imagine 42,500 camps and they didn't know? And the final score, of course, there were 11 million murdered, 6 million of them Jews, 1 million of them children. We put our lives back together, and I started going to school, but then within 2.5 years, the communists took over, and in 1948, because my father was in trouble with the communists for a number of reasons, because he had fought with the Western armies rather than the Eastern armies, and my parents were blacklisted as enemies of the communist state. We escaped in February of 1948. We took 3 suitcases and one bundle of blankets that I carried with some jewelry inside, and we walked 3.5 hours through a forest into the U.S. zone of Germany. So we headed west, and this is what our total assets look like. This is a picture from a refugee camp, a DP camp we were in Ludwigsburg, Germany, one of 3 camps we were in, and for about 1.5 years waiting to get visas to come to the U.S. This was our ship. We came in on an overcrowded Army transport ship. And like most immigrants, I experienced some culture shock. We actually came on what is today Memorial Day, what was then called Declaration Day. The only funny thing about that was we came into New York, and our friends who were our sponsors drove us through Manhattan, and every building had an American flag, and I thought that the flags were for me, that they were, and they straightened me out on that pretty quickly. I had my name changed because our sponsor told me that people would murder my first name, which was Otta. So I kept the Otta, but as a middle name when we translated Karel to Charles. So that has been my name since I got my citizenship in 1954. I was sent to North Carolina to a camp where nobody spoke Czech. I knew 2 words of English, thank you. And I came back from North Carolina with a southern accent, and our friends in New York thought that was worse than not speaking English at all. My father, on day 1, my father said to me, and this is a direct quote that I wrote down at the time, "This is an order. You will forget everything that happened to you on the other side of the Atlantic. I want you to be a 100% American, and I want you to have no accent 12 months from today." And I actually did it. And I embraced American sports. I got a basketball scholarship to go to college. I met a beautiful American girl. She and I will celebrate our 55th anniversary next month. Oh, thank you. Oh, she'll appreciate that, I'll tell her. That you commiserated with her. Live the American dream. I won't bore you with all of that. This is a picture from my alma mater, Oklahoma State University. We enjoyed life. This is my son, David, and my wife, Sue. And down below that is a picture of our whole family with grandkids. And we raced sailboats. I've skied all over the world, just enjoyed life and just completely forgot about everything that happened on the other side, just as my father had ordered. And then my father died in 1988 because my father had got malaria when he was fighting in the desert in North Africa. And as a result of that, he had heart disease, and he died in Houston after an open heart surgery. For me, it was much more. His death was just tragic to me because he was my mentor. He was my confessor and everything to me. But it was also more than that. First thing that happened, I didn't know what to do about a service for my father. And we had never discussed religion. I don't know, my father perhaps when he was a kid might have gone to synagogue, but he never did during my lifetime. And I didn't know what to do, so I literally looked into the Morristown, New Jersey Yellow Pages, and I found a rabbi. And I had a rabbi preside over his service. And this is actually the first time that our friends and my wife's family knew anything about the Jewish side of my family, and I really wondered how these people would feel. And to my great surprise, they couldn't care less what religion we were. But I also started feeling very guilty at that point for not having really, not having honored all those people who had died in the camps and my family members and so forth. And it was quite a turning point in my life in starting to think about those things. And then on top of that, a year and a half later, of course, the Berlin Wall came down, and in the Czech Republic, or in what was then Czechoslovakia, they had something called the Velvet Revolution, because no shots were fired where the communists were thrown out. And this became a turning point for me as well, because I started going back. Both to get back some of our properties, but also to be, I gave workshops and roundtables to managers of newly privatized companies. So I spent a lot of time there early on, starting in 1990. And I started reconnecting with friends, with the language, with the culture, and with my ethnicity, and started really honoring what had happened before. And then on top of that, I took a business trip. It was actually sponsored by the governor of Maryland, a trade mission to Israel. And during that trade mission, we had some free time. We had one free day. We could do anything we wanted. So I chose to go to Yad Vashem. Yad Vashem is a place where the righteous are honored. The righteous are Christians who protected Jews during World War II. And we have friends. Our farmer friends, unfortunately, are not in Yad Vashem, but other friends who are being honored, who have trees that are growing in a Yad Vashem. And from there's a Holocaust museum, and I went into that Holocaust museum. And I'm walking around, I'm looking at the pictures of Jews being beaten up by German guards and all of these horrible scenes. And tears are coming out of my eyes, and I come around a corner, and I see a bunch of Israeli soldiers in uniform with Uzi strapped to their backs and with a guide. And they're all young, they're all 18, 19, 20 years old. And I walked up to them and I joined their group. I didn't understand a word of Hebrew that the guide was saying, but I'm looking at these soldiers and I'm saying, oh, this is incredible. I feel such a connection to these people. And these are the kids who are not ever going to let this happen again. And I started really becoming quite connected to Israel and to the Jewish people. And I started asking myself, am I a Catholic? Am I a Jew? Am I both? Am I none? And then I decided, it doesn't really make any difference. I honor God in my own way. And I now understand my own story much better than I ever did before. And as I started recognizing this, I also started talking to Rotary clubs and so forth who got very interested in the story, and I would tell people, and they would invite me to come talk to them. And everywhere I went, people say, oh, you've got to write a book. And I kept resisting, and I kept resisting. And finally, a few things pushed me over the line. Number one being all the Holocaust deniers who are all over the world. Number one. Number two, the fact that so many people, young people, don't really know anything about the history of World War II and the Holocaust. So I decided that I really had to write a book. So I did. This is my book. This is why I call my talk Prague, My Long Journey Home. And I've been on book tour with it off and on throughout the country ever since. So now I feel an obligation as a witness to go around, as do many other people, to talk about this. And as I travel, I find that there are some people who couldn't care less, and who are totally ignorant and don't want to be any less ignorant. But on the other hand, I'm really quite pleased to see all the people who are interested, like you. I mean, you wouldn't be here otherwise. And children. I've gone to many schools and I've talked to schools, and I think the most touching moment that I had happened not very far from here. Last year I was at Mount DeSales Academy, which is a high school, which is a school for Catholic girls, and they were studying the Holocaust. And I told them my story, and when I finished, a little blonde, beautiful girl walked up to me. And she put her hand on my forearm, and she said, "Don't worry, we won't ever let it happen again." And it broke me up then, and it still breaks me up when I think about it. And I'm so glad that you're all here and that you won't let it happen again. Thank you very much.
Those who are able to, may please stand. El Molei Rachamim Shochein B'Mromim Hamsei Menucha Nechona Al Kanfei HaShechina B'Malos Kedoshim U'Torim Kizara Harakiya Masivim Es Nishmos HaKadoshim B'Torim Shehumsu V'Shenergu V'Shenisnachatu V'Shenisrafu V'Shenitbu V'Shenachnaku Al Kiddush Hashem Ayidei HaTzavarim HaGarmanim Yamach Shamam Zichonom B'Gan Eden Temenu Chasam L'chein B'Larachamim Yastireim B'Seisek N'Afav L'Olamim V'Yitzua Chayim Es Nishmosehem Adonai Yunach L'Som Yanuach B'Shalom Mishkovosehem V'Neimar Amen. O God full of mercy, who dwells on high, grant proper rest on the wings of the divine presence and the lofty levels of the holy and pure ones, who shine like the glow of the firmament for the souls of the holy and pure ones who were killed, murdered, slaughtered, burned, drowned, and strangled, for the sanctification of the name. Through the hands of the German oppressors, may their name and memory be obliterated in the camps of Auschwitz, Dachau, Dachausen, Trieschendadt, Buchenwald, Bergen-Belsen, Medanik, Treblinka. May the resting place be in the Garden of Eden. Therefore, may the Master of Mercy shelter them in the shelter of his wings for eternity, and may he bind up their souls in the bond of life. The Almighty is their heritage, and may they repose in peace on the resting place. And let us respond, Amen.
Testing. What? for brightly, though their time with us is done. But the stars that light up the darkest nights, these are the lights that guide us as we live our days. These are the ways we remember. We remember as we live our days. These are the ways we remember. We remember. יש כוכבים שאורם מגיע ארצה, רק כאשר הם עצמם עבדו בעינם. יש אנשים שזיו ספרת מאיר, כאשר הם עצמם בינם עוד בתוכנו. אור ארצנו המביקים וחשכת הליל. הם שמראים לאדם את הדרך, את הדרך. הם שמראים לאדם את הדרך, את הדרך. As we live our days, these are the ways we remember. We remember. As we live our days, these are the ways we remember. We remember. We remember. We remember. כשתבוא ביום מן הימים, ימים שנרתמים בקצה תפילה. כשתבוא נגיש לכם פרחים, פרחים שנפתחים למילה. תתעטף נשאיר לך בשקט, נשאיר לך ברוך, ונחכה ונלטף עד שתצטרף. אז נשאיר ברוך, נשאיר ברוך, נשאיר ברוך. שתבוא הביתה מן הקור, הביתה אל האור הלב יברד. שתבוא מבעד הדמעות תבחין באותיות לחובש נולד.
their seats, please join me in another hand for the Krieger Schechter Middle School Choir. I'm Anita Pender. I'm the Director of the Office of Equal Opportunity and Civil Rights, and thank you for joining us here today. As our executive sponsor, Denise, spoke of the importance of continuing to remember the Holocaust. Again, that we're charged to never forget. We must never forget the atrocities committed during the Holocaust. We must not forget the many who continue to be oppressed even today, be it because of race, religion, or even ideology. We must not forget that we must hold the perpetrators and ourselves accountable. We must not let the Holocaust and its brutality slip into the recesses of our mind, but keep it in front and center so that we can ensure never again. We should use this painful period to remind us of the importance of valuing our diversity, both our similarities and our differences, for they contribute to both our strength and enriches our lives. Each year when I participate in the program, I'm touched by the experiences of the survivors, such as Mr. Heller. And while there's a sense of sadness at the suffering that is recounted, I am encouraged by the strength and the perseverance, the hope, and the triumph of the human spirit. That does encourage me in my daily walk, and so I'm grateful for those who did in fact survive and continue to take upon both the joy and the burden of sharing experiences. Mr. Heller, again, thank you for sharing your story with us. Again, all the more poignant that it comes from a child's perspective. And I'll just say, not to run counter to what your parents said, but those flags were for you when you arrived. For they were the symbols of freedom and opportunity that you've been able to enjoy and leverage, the hope that is the promise for all of us. So in addition to thanking Mr. Heller, so again, if you could join me in another round of applause for him. I also want to thank Rabbi Schur and again the children's choir. I must say, I also get a little nostalgic every time the choir comes because I've been doing these long enough that for a while I'm like, oh, there she is. She was here last year. Look how tall she is. And oh, look at him. He's getting facial hair. And like now, and now there's like a new crew that I'll, be watching as the years go. But again, thank you so much. And I miss Sean for bringing the choir out. I also want to thank the Office of Communications and the Office of Operations Management, again, for their support of the programs. And again, many thanks to our executive sponsor, the Office of E-Health Standards and Services, and Denise for you being here today with us. I also want to thank the Planning Committee. Really the Holocaust Planning Committee, they are just a model of efficiency. They get in and they get the program planned, and even if for some reason we weren't calling them, they'd be calling us because they know the schedule and they're very much focused on the task. So again, I appreciate all the hard work of the Planning Committee. And last but not least, I want to thank all of you again for taking the time out to join us here today. Not only those here in the auditorium here in Baltimore, but those who are in our regional offices in DC and in Bethesda. I do hope that you have learned and there's something that you can take away from the program. There are evaluations in your programs. I would ask that you would fill those out to give us feedback, again, so that we can continually improve. But again, thank you for your participation. I hope you enjoy the rest of the day. And again, we must never forget. Thank you.